inaugural Horizon 3 Biotech Investing webinar hosted by Horizon 3 Biotech Fund and sponsored by FB Rice and Monsoon Communications. As some invitees were unable to attend, we have been asked to record this webinar, so please be aware it is being recorded. And before we begin, a disclaimer: the purpose of this presentation is not to give financial product advice. If any financial product advice is given in the presentation, the standard disclaimers, that is, that it is general advice only, apply. That is, it has been prepared without taking into account any person's objectives, financial situation or needs, and therefore you should consider the appropriateness of the advice in light of your own situation and requirements. Now, we're very fortunate to have two seasoned biotech analysts, and apologies if that makes them sound old, but we are, on the panel today, Dr. Graeme Wald and Mr. Scott Power, who will be providing their insights into biotech investing and answering your questions. So please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. I think it's down the bottom, anytime from now, and we will address as many of these as possible after we hear from the panelists. We have had a good number of questions already, so apologies if we can't answer all your questions. First, we're going to do a map on the horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. Firstly, some of you might have seen the recently published MTP Connect COVID-19 Impact Report that was prepared by LEK Consulting Australia. The report says that in the period March to May 2020, up to 90% of clinical trials were put on hold. Since May, the sector has begun its recovery, enabling the resumption of many activities, including clinical trials, preclinical R&D activity, and elective surgeries. And not surprisingly, the recent Melbourne lockdowns are creating challenges and is costly. The report said the sector played a key role in response to the pandemic, with organisations working closely with federal and state and territory governments to develop local manufacturing capabilities for essential medical equipment and supplies such as ventilators and personal protective equipment. The report also says that key actions were to improve supply chain resilience, enhance sovereign supply and manufacturing capabilities, and to invest in R&D and next generation technologies related to pandemics. Now, COVID-19 has also driven innovation, the adoption of new technologies and behavioural changes at an unprecedented rate, presenting opportunities for post-pandemic growth for the sector, including virtual consultations and remote monitoring, along with the growth in home delivery of medical supplies to patients. So I thought that was a good report. Next, I just want to look at the federal budget. I'm not sure how many of you have been following that, but the R&D tax incentive bill, thankfully, the planned changes have been abandoned. And for small claimants, turnover of less than 20 million, that would be 99.9% of its audience, I suspect, the government will increase the refundable R&D tax incentive offset of 18.5 percentage points above the claimant's company tax rate, and there will be no $4 million cap on annual cash refunds. So very, very good news for the sector. For larger claimants, the government will streamline the intensity test from 3 to 2 tiers and increase the non-refundable R&D tax offset rates. Interestingly, also the government will provide $1.5 billion over 5 years to support the modern manufacturing strategy, supporting 6 areas of comparative advantage and strategic interests. And this includes medical products, so that's great. Supporting manufacturing projects focused on building long-term business collaboration at scale, translating research into commercial outcomes and bringing new products to market. Now, in some FDA news, the bad and the good, Mesoblast has been asked to conduct a further clinical trial to support their graft versus host disease registration. Conversely, the FDA has granted Telix Pharmaceuticals orphan drug designation for their 18F FET for the positron emission tomography imaging of glioma, a type of brain tumour. And this orphan drug designation qualifies Telix for various drug development incentives, which may include market exclusivity for 7 years, waived FDA drug user fees, and tax credits for R&D and clinical development costs. And finally, just yesterday, Opthea announced its plans to raise 220 million Aussie dollars this week in American depository shares to list on the NASDAQ market. So watch this space. Now we turn to our panel members, Scott and Graeme. You've both had a lot of experience and success in the biotech sector. For the benefit of the audience, would you mind imparting your knowledge on the following two questions? And can I start with you, Graeme? What are some of the key aspects of a biotech investment that you look out for?
Oh, thank you, Matt. Key issues that we look at are firstly management in terms of their track record in being able to achieve what they say they will achieve. Secondly, we want to see good intellectual property so that we know that the company will be able to have a monopoly on its product for a significant period of time. The type of IP is also important. And then we also want to see a very good, what I call a target product profile. So what I mean by that is how much in demand will the drug be? What is the actual indication that it's going to? How well addressed is that market? What is the size of that market? And what are the problems that it overcomes? And then, of course, that also goes to other things like what is the regulatory pathway? Is it a brand new type of pathway, which adds to the risk? Is it a regulatory pathway that is well trodden? And then, of course, the big thing is the path to reimbursement, making sure that there is that the market has the ability to pay for the product. So those are some of the main things that I look at in a company when we first meet.
Thanks, Graeme. And Scott, what are some of the key aspects of biotech investment that you look out for?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So Graeme mentioned good quality management. That sort of goes without saying. I'll just extend on that. I think also having the CEO and all the directors having put some serious money into the company themselves. So they've got a bit of hurt money. So you know, they've got a lot to lose if things don't work. The other point is just in terms, particularly the listed market, the sector tends to go in cycles. So you really want to be out there trying to raise money while that cycle's positive, and certainly we're in that phase at the moment. So you know, just to give the listeners a bit of a sense of what's happening in the listed market at the moment, if we look at the last quarter, ended the end of September. We had 32 companies come and raise money from the market and 2 IPOs, and they raised a total of just under $400 million. So there's risk capital out there at the moment, and the cycle is positive for the healthcare and life science sector. The other point that's worth touching on is just having some very realistic timeframes for the development of the project, whether it's a device, a therapeutic, or a diagnostic. The listed market does have a time frame and can be a little short-sighted at times, and it's really important that the companies understand that those time frames are there, and you need to sort of work within that, and that quite often is not easy to do. And then just finally, I'll just point out that having some very clear catalysts and milestones that can be measured. So quite often what we see is companies have very technical, scientific explanations of what they're doing. If you can simplify that down to a couple of key catalysts that can be measured simply by more general type investors, that's very important for investing in the market.
Thanks, guys. So, Scott, is there a particular company that's on your radar that ticks most of these boxes? And I need to reiterate to the audience that this is not financial product advice.
Yeah, so the company that I think ticks most of those boxes is a company that we've had an involvement before it listed, and then IPO'd the company and then have raised subsequent money for, and that's a company called Volpara. So VHT is the ticker. Basically, they have technology which aids in the early detection of breast cancer. It is founder-led, so Ralph Hinem is one of the major shareholders in the company. He developed this technology as part of his PhD back in the year 2000. So fast forward 20 years, the product is now successfully in the market. Graeme touched on the importance of intellectual property to be able to sort of maintain a market-leading position. Volpara certainly has that. So in terms of its penetration into the marketplace, one or more of Volpara's products is being used across 27% of the population in the US that undertake a mammogram. So that's about 10 million women are using one or more of Volpara's products. So their IP position is very strong. It's market leading, and that has enabled them to secure that very strong market share. In terms of their revenue model, again, this is really interesting, and it has evolved over time, moved more from a capital base to what we call SaaS, software as a service type revenue. So basically every time a mammogram is read, Volpara picks up around about $1.10 US per screen. So that's the way they get paid. These contracts they enter into are usually 5-year contracts, and the average size is around about 50,000 US. And then finally, in terms of catalysts, got a number of key catalysts that the investors and certainly us as analysts are focusing in on. There's a sort of macro theme that's about to evolve in the US with the FDA mandating that every woman that undertakes a mammogram must have or must be informed of her breast density. And that will be law shortly. The FDA said they'll have that written up by the end of October. So that's a short-term catalyst. And then in terms of what the company is doing, they're constantly winning new contracts and they report to the stock market every quarter. So we're able to pick up information on new contract wins. So that's Volpara. It ticks most of the boxes we're looking for.
Thanks, Scott. That's a good summary. And Graeme, is there a particular company that's on your radar that currently ticks most of the boxes?
Yeah, it's a company called Casia Therapeutics. They've got a market cap of approximately $80 to $100 million. Now, I noticed that this morning, I think an announcement came out that they successfully raised an additional $25 million. This is a company that is developing a drug for glioblastoma, which is a terrible form of brain cancer, and there's basically no real treatment for it. The only treatment that is approved is a drug that's been around for a very, very long time and is not particularly successful at treating glioblastomas. So Casia has licensed a drug from Genentech, and most people would know that Genentech is one of the world's leaders in biotechnology, and I guess many would also agree that it was the first proper biotechnology company. They've licensed this product from Genentech, which has a unique ability thus far in the treatment of brain cancers, in that it is able to pass through what is known as the blood-brain barrier, which is particularly important if you want to treat a tumor that's sitting in the brain. So they have published some clinical trials already, phase 1-2 type studies, and they have shown that they're able to extend a patient's life by at least 5 months, which might not sound like a lot, but in the case of the alternative is a very impressive feat indeed. So that would be the top pick for me at the moment, or the one that I'm currently very interested in looking at. Also because management is very good. They have delivered. They've got a lot of experience, and the drug from a target product profile ticks all the boxes. It will get reimbursement. It's going through, once it's approved, it's going through a pathway, a regulatory pathway that is well known. They're not treading new ground there. The only really new thing in it is that it's able to cross the blood-brain barrier, which of course is a major advantage.
Okay, thanks for that, Graeme. That's two very interesting companies. And so now we're going to take some questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the Q&A button down below on your Zoom screen. We have had a good number of questions already submitted. The first two I'm going to throw into the same bucket, from Chris at Exopharm and from Jonathan. They asked, how do the state and federal response affect your investment view of the industry? And then the second question was, what would it take for Australia to build a biotech hub that rivals Israel? Lumping them together, because throughout the 20 years that I've been investing, state governments have varied widely. Victoria has and is the most supportive of our sector, in my opinion. Federal has been consistently supportive. The R&D tax rebate was not looking good there for a while, but that's a positive sign from COVID. Healthcare is a recession-proof sector, so I'm always looking forward in that respect. And commentators often say that government should be doing more. I suspect many sectors say the same, but I appreciate all the assistance government lends to the sector: R&D tax rebate, instant asset write-off, modern manufacturing program, etc. However, ultimately, it's up to the company to make something of itself. And with respect to hubs, Australia has created hubs, what I would say organically, without making a concerted effort from scratch, like Israel or Singapore, or you know, and I suspect Silicon Valley and Boston is sort of organic as well. I don't know enough about the Israeli biotech hub, except to say I believe it's being well supported, and the jury is out as to how successful it is. I get the sense that the modern manufacturing program in the latest budget could be a real fillip to our medical manufacturing industry and maybe create a hub of sorts. And Graeme, do you have a view on this topic?
Yeah. I guess one of the first things I would say is that, and maybe you remember this, Matt, but probably many people in the audience don't know this, that I did work for a while in Israel at the Weizmann Institute. And with respect to a hub, I guess the key thing that came across in my time there, and I've got a colleague who graduated from the Weizmann Institute, is that when you go in and you do your studies or you do your research, it is very multidisciplinary. You will go in to present your results at a seminar or tell people about the type of work that you are doing, and whether you're a biochemist or a physical chemist, whatever, there will be people from all sorts of disciplines at the presentation, and every single one of them will ask very different questions which lead you to think in a different way about how to tackle a problem. And that to me is a core issue when it comes to having hubs, and that is the cross-disciplinary approach to looking at how to solve different problems. So you could be developing a drug, but then suddenly someone will think of something with regard to the mode of delivery, and then someone will start looking at the material science aspects of it, or start looking at various other critical issues which you may not have thought of, or which may actually advance the technology in a faster manner, or even lead to additional intellectual property. So I guess what I'm saying is that when it comes to hubs, to me it's more a multidisciplinary approach, the ability to interact with colleagues from other fields and discuss different approaches, which I think has been one of the key successes in the development of, for want of a better description, of high-tech industry in Israel. But then there's also the issue of access to capital, which comes into it. What you'll find there is that most of those companies will head off to the US to raise capital, which you know, which makes sense. You know, Israel is a small country, so one shouldn't be afraid of tapping international markets for cash. There are, of course, two ways of doing it. One, you go directly onto that market, or you try and convince them to come and invest in Australia. And there are horses for courses. Sometimes it's better to go straight to the US. Sometimes it's better to raise capital here. I hope that gives you a bit of an indication of what my thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you, Graeme. That's good. Next question comes from Peter. Which biotechs have been financially successful in the last 10 years in Australia? Maybe I could ask Scott to give us your opinion on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I actually started listing a few of them down, and it depends how you sort of want to describe that 10-year period. There's been, some absolute stunning performances over the last 12 months, and if you look over the 10 years, there's been some companies that have done really well, but then have dwindled away. So, it depends when you buy and sell these shares, I guess. And, it's an interesting point that, over the long term, it's probably hard to sort of really pick and stay with those winners. But the ones that I have written down very quickly, Matt, you mentioned in your in your introduction, Opthea. I mean, that's done remarkably well, or not remarkably well. It's done very, very well. Over the last couple of years, it's methodically gone through, ticked off its clinical trial program, and today it's looking to raise a significant amount of money in the US. So, they've really done very well. And a little bit what Graeme was saying, don't be afraid to go overseas. And these guys have tapped the US market before, and now they're looking to list. So that's a really interesting story. One that I completely missed, and I'm really kicking myself, is Clinuvel. I think again that's been a long-term sleeper. I can remember looking at that back, when it was 40 cents, probably 15 years ago, maybe more. And now, it's a $1.2 billion company. Probably Avita Medical falls into the same category. Again, that was one that I was involved with in the early days, and felt the market was probably too small and too niche, and, let it go. And, since that point, it's up, almost 20 times. So, that's one that I have to say I've totally missed. And on that same vein, Polynovo, another sort of wound care company, I think has done very well over the last couple of years. So there's some really, a couple of examples of companies that have done well recently. If I can now point out a couple of companies that have had successes in the past, but have now dwindled back, and looking to try and reinvent themselves, or waiting for the next sort of pivot point. A company like Acrux, Impedimed, and Resap. I can remember seeing Resap. I think I saw them at an AusBio conference probably 4 or 5 years ago. Their share price was 2 cents. Some technology that came out of Queensland Uni ran up to 60 cents. It's raised a number of tranches of money over that period of time, and now it's back at 10 cents. So it's at a very interesting pivot point in terms of its commercialization, and the technology has been ticked off by the Europeans, and they're looking to do some commercial deals. So that's at an interesting point. So it's a really good question to ask. What are the companies that have succeeded over those 10 years, and at what point can you come in and make the money, and then when do you sort of look to book some of your profit? And that was a really interesting exercise. So great question. Back to you, Matt.
Matt, maybe if I could jump in here with a couple of comments as well. Many people say that it takes a company 10, 15, 20 years to become an overnight success. But if you look at a company that I think that has gone about getting to market very methodically and has built up its market capitalization and its exposure to the US market, one of those would be Nanosonics, which has been a really remarkable performer right from when it was listed at a market cap, I think, of about $50 million, and I think is now close to $1 billion, or maybe in excess of that. But I think another aspect is the ability of companies to change course when needed. And by that I mean, let's face it, a lot of companies are being funded to conduct experiments. That's basically what we're doing in this sector, and those experiments are very big clinical trials. And there's always the risk that that clinical trial will fail. And we have seen some successes in companies reading the writing on the wall about their current technology but having the ability, the management ability and skills to pivot the company to look for a different technology and then try and commercialize that. I think the one that comes to mind there is a company, gosh, it's been around for 15, 20 years under various names, a company called Biotech. They've got what's called the LAG-3 inhibitor for oncology, for a range of different oncologies. And it's got a market cap now, probably also around $80 to $100 million. And they have reinvented themselves as they've gone through the process of trying to find a product to commercialize. And now they've got their LAG-3 inhibitor, which hits a number of different types of cancers, but also they're very closely linked in their research work to big pharma, to BMS. So I think the ability of management to pivot when required and to place resources where appropriate is also a very important aspect that we shouldn't forget about.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys, both of you. My tuppence worth is that, when I started investing in this sector 20 years ago, we were thinking that we were very small and there weren't enough success stories. And I think what you guys have just exhibited is that the number of success stories is building up. We'll never be as big as the US and some of these bigger areas, but every year we get some positive development, and so therefore the ecosystem and the whole performance of the Australian market is improving. Maybe not as quickly as we'd all like, but it's moving in the right direction. Our next question comes from William. How do you work out if a drug candidate has a chance of passing drug trials, especially if they are pre-trial? Graeme, maybe I'll ask you to answer that, please.
Well, there's a philosophy that I take. If a company is in their product is still in the preclinical stage, in other words, that it's still being tested on rats and mice and those sorts of things. The simple philosophy I take there is that in many cases the rats simply lie. So you always look at preclinical trials with a certain degree of skepticism, but I think what one needs to do really is talk to the experts and find out how relevant those animal trials are as models for the human condition. And we know there is always a risk that they don't work. But I think that the types of animals and the genetic makeup of the animals that are now available for testing give one a fairly good idea of what is going to happen. And remember that many of these, that many candidates fail at this stage, not because they don't hit the correct biochemical pathway, so to speak, but maybe because they simply don't work fast enough. So that's one of the key issues. One has to try and use experience as well as speaking to many experts. When it gets into the human phase, the first issue that one looks at is safety. But there are so many new ways of constructing initial trials that in many cases you are able to get a small indication, one hopes, on a safety trial that there is some level of efficacy. Bottom line though is that you never do really know, but you just have to talk to as many experts as possible. And a key issue I think for anyone who is investing is realizing that we simply aren't experts in all the areas of biochemistry or technology, but it's being able to tap into those resources and having the ability to question them and make sure that they are relevant for the investment that you're looking at.
I might just add one really little thing. It might be just a functional thing, but in light of the question, Graeme mentioned rats and mice, etc., but you can move up to what they call non-human primates, and so these are macaque monkeys and stuff like that, which are obviously much closer to the human. They're very expensive trials, and I think they're ethically very sensitive. But that is another technique some people use to test pre-human trials on close to human trials. Next question from Kerry. You fellows have long been in the VC space in Australia. Do you feel there is sufficient diversity? Rate your sector's performance. So I might have set myself up for this one with putting the three of us up here. But look, I have 5 women in my household, and I was advised the other day that I am a feminist, and that surprised me until they explained that a feminist strives for equality. And I said, oh, okay, well, yeah, I'm a feminist. So I look at this panel, and it was not a conscious decision to have 3 white middle-aged men. But funnily enough, a woman did contact me to say she would not be attending for that reason. And it's her protest vote. And so now we will be more conscious. However, we'll not just slavishly fill quotas. But so I thank that lady who contacted us. And I don't have enough knowledge on other sectors' performance to be able to rate our sector. However, I do suspect that we are not the shining light. But unless someone disagrees with me, we can leave it there.
Yeah, I agree with that, Matt. I think we're quite shallow with our investment pool.
Yeah. Okay. Next question is from Yagi. Strategies for attracting investment in early stage biotech. Graeme, that's your area.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, well, it says strategies. So I presume it's what are the strategies? What are some suggested strategies for attracting investment in early stage biotech?
Okay. Make sure you've got a decent pair of walking shoes. You have to be able to deliver a message that gets people excited about what you're doing. So the passion has to come across. That sounds a little bit flippant, but that is a very important part of the process, because in many cases you're talking to investors who are not really familiar, of course, with the fine scientific detail that would probably, that is appropriate to that investment. So it's the excitement, it's the ability to communicate what this means in the real world. And I'm a firm believer in the 30-second elevator pitch. If you can't explain it in 30 seconds, well, everyone's eyes will just simply glaze over. When it comes to, you finally get the meeting with who you want to talk to, make sure you do your homework on what that person is potentially looking for. What I found quite astounding, and I'm sure, Matt, you're very familiar with this as well, is you'll get a company coming along to pitch to you, not understanding how you as a fund manager work. What are the sorts of investments that you can make? Depends on the mandate of that investment. And all of that information is generally freely available, or if not, then a simple discussion with the potential investor before you go and meet with them to find out what their investment criteria are goes a long way to not wasting other people's time, and secondly, it also forewarns you as to the sorts of key issues that they would want you to potentially concentrate on. So I think those are some of the key issues that one needs to look at to try and attract that initial investment, or the early stage investment rather.
Thank you. Next question is from John. How do you get around the problem of a small home market, Australia, with global product without selling off the technology overseas? Scott, want to have a crack at that?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think it comes down to just being realistic. I think, a lot of healthcare and life sciences are global businesses. So all the technology has global applications. So, you do need the FDA approval, or the CE mark approval, or TGA, and you've got to be prepared and realistic in terms of what you can achieve within Australia. And if that does mean licensing off at a particular stage in the company's lifespan, then that's what needs to be done. And what we find, I guess, often is that, particularly when the cycle's against you, is that companies just run short of money, so they're constantly compromising and perhaps having to do deals earlier in the piece. But that's just the reality of it. I don't have any good answer to solve that problem. I think it's just being realistic and recognizing that quite often your technology will have global application, and the question is, how do you how can you best deliver that?
It's well,
I think sorry, Matt. I think Scott's answer there sort of hits the nail on the head. Of course, these are global industries, and I think the question is equally applicable to any company around the world, including those in the US. There simply comes a point where you may need the assistance of big pharma to get your product to market. So you need to set up the structures, the entire funding strategy. You need to set that up pretty early in the company's development, so that when the time comes, you can try and negotiate the best terms that you can. And that, I think, also goes to the type of investors that you have. And that also goes into the comment that I made earlier, that you should try and have investors from around the world who are strong believers in your company and are able to fund you through the various stages of development. And then you can set yourself up for exiting in the best manner possible.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, guys. Another John has asked, what type of opportunities will the fund be focusing on, i.e. drugs, devices, therapeutic area, and what stage of development? And Con also asked, how early will we be investing? I'll address that. So this is the broadest mandate that I have worked with as far as fund investing. So we will invest in drugs, devices, diagnostics, and digital healthcare in both public and private companies, predominantly focusing on Australia, but we will look at international opportunities. We will look at earlier opportunities, but not seed or startup or Series A, but certainly approaching human testing and in human testing clinical trials. We're looking to make about 8 investments into predominantly Australian companies that can make a difference to the health of people worldwide. We're not selecting specific areas, but obviously reviewing a lot of COVID-related technologies at the moment. And the idea is to deliver a 20+% IRR to our investors. So when we look at each portfolio company upon investment, we like to think that it has the potential to deliver a 1x or a 1 times return per annum of investment. So that in a nutshell is our investment strategy. Yes, we look at early, but earlier, not super early, and we're looking at products that can make a difference. And then it comes to our last question from Patrick. I'm interested to know the reach and influence of the various global drug licensing approval bodies, the influence of the FDA. Scott, maybe I could ask you to address that broad question.
Yeah, well, the US is typically the largest market, and the FDA is the gatekeeper there. So that's usually where most of the valuation is created for companies. I think what we've seen since COVID is that the European regulatory authority is in a bit of a mess. Dealing even with a CE mark, I think a lot of the individual countries over there have their own particular ways of dealing with it. So it's not as cohesive as the US. So I think, the US FDA is the sort of gold standard that most companies tend to attack. We've had this disruption in Europe with COVID and their sort of process. So, the answer to their question is the US FDA is the sort of gold standard and what where you gain most value for your business.
And I wonder if either of you know of the MSAC. I'll paraphrase what I know about it, in that it is sort of a parallel regulatory strategy approach that covers off both Europe, US, and Australia. Does anyone know about MSAC?
No, Matt, I can't say
Nope.
I've come across
Nope.
it.
Okay. Well,
Nope.
homework for me for the next webinar, which, speaking of, is in a fortnight on the 27th of October. We plan to discuss maybe MTech, but also accessing US capital and or the FDA regulatory process. So I'd like to thank you to the audience for feedback and suggestions. Are most welcome. If you feel we can improve or you have a suggestion for content, please do not hesitate to email me at matt@horizon3biotech.com. Now, thanks go to FB Wright and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting this webinar. Finally, thank you to both of our panelists, Graeme, Wald and Scott Power. See you all again at the same time in a fortnight, and stay safe. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.